Doing anthropology showed me that actually our preconceptions and prejudices that we inherit from our own world can be wrong. And the most effective research is when we actually learn to listen and learn and open our eyes to the possibility there may be other ways of looking at the world.
Welcome to the Future in Sound podcast. I'm your host, Jen Wilson. This is a podcast where we talk about prioritizing people, planet, and profit. In each episode, we'll learn from world-leading experts who can help us see the future we want and our role in it. Quick story. 10 years ago, I met the guest on the show today. I was working in Dublin at the time, and I spotted her a row ahead of me on a flight back to London. It was one of my favorite journalists, Gillian Tett, a reporter from the Financial Times. As we were disembarking from the flight, we had a quick chat. I rarely feel like a fangirl, but in this moment, that is precisely what I was. Picture Gillian typing away on her BlackBerry, trying to meet a deadline, and there I was enthusiastically describing how I enjoyed her columns, books, and other books by anthropologists. When I started talking about an ethnography of a bank by Karen Ho called Liquidated, Gillian looked up from her phone, smiled, and said, "That's niche." A common phrase in business is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. The field of anthropology is all about studying culture. So why don't we use anthropology tools in business? Gillian Tett has recently released a book that is doing just that. Her new book, Anthro-Vision, is taking the niche topic we discussed on the plane and making it mainstream. Gillian Tett is chair of the Editorial Board and Editor-at-Large of the Financial Times. She writes weekly columns covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues. What I've personally found special about Gillian's work for over a decade is that her unique lens allows her to see important trends before her peers. Her book, Fool's Gold, was early in predicting the financial crisis of 2007. She also started the Financial Times Moral Money newsletter just before sustainable business and finance became mainstream. Today, Gillian and I will be discussing her latest book, Anthro-Vision, a new way to see in business and life. Gillian, I'm delighted to have you on the Future in Sound podcast. Welcome.
Delighted to be taking part of it. Thanks for inviting me.
I wanted to start with a bit of your journey. I'm interested, you started journalism after completing your PhD in anthropology. How did you draw on your background in anthropology as a journalist?
Well, my journey was totally weird. And I sometimes think that my role in life is to reassure parents whose offspring want to go and study anthropology instead of accounting that they will actually get a job. Because, not much of my life was planned, but it's turned out to be very, very powerful as a combination of skills to do my job. In my role as a journalist, I look at economics, finance, and business. And that would seem to have nothing to do with most people's vision of anthropology, which is a bit like the academic equivalent of Indiana Jones, people who go off into far-flung places and look at bones and rituals and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, I passionately believe that anthropology has helped me do my job as journalist much better. It's enabled me to foresee the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of techlash, the victory of Donald Trump, and also, I'd say, the rise of the sustainability movement. And I actually think that anthropology can actually help many people in many spheres of life, wherever you're working, to understand both how your customers and your suppliers might be behaving, but also to understand how your colleagues are behaving and where the world's going, which frankly everybody needs to do right now, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely. Now I have an admission to make. Gillian, I think we've met before, very briefly, and I do not expect you to remember this, but I remember when I joined Bain, I was this graduate student from Oxford, and several friends were anthropologists, and they recommended this wonderful book by Karen Ho called Liquidated. And I read it just before I started a new job at Bain. And it was a fascinating experience to have read an ethnography of Wall Street and then start working in the financial sector as a consultant. And so when I was traveling back and forth to Dublin from London, I think I spotted you on a plane, and you were hard at work on your BlackBerry at the time, I think working toward a deadline. I was like, Anthropology, Karen Ho. And I think when I started mentioning that, you looked up from your BlackBerry and you smiled at me. And I thought to myself, yes, a fellow enthusiast on anthropology and business.
The Blackberries have changed these days. We don't have Blackberries anymore for the most part, but I remain passionate about Karen Ho, who, for anybody who's working in banking or finance or markets, anyone who cares about the concept of shareholder capitalism and its flaws should read that, because it's a really insightful book.
Absolutely. And so when you are taking your anthropology or Anthro-Vision lens, how do you apply it in your day-to-day at the Financial Times? What are some of the steps that you might take with an anthropology background that others might not?
Well, saying that you want to use anthropology to inform the world is a bit like saying that you want to conquer anger or you want to go on a diet and eat healthy, and that you do it for a bit and then you forget. And when you forget, you realize actually it costs you. So in my case, I've been using anthropology to try and do really three things. One is to think about the lens that I use in the world to make sense of the world. And that's really about trying to employ not tunnel vision, but lateral vision to, above all else, do something that anthropologists are trained to do, which is look at social silence. We live in a world where we all pay attention to the noise, but the silence is often the most important thing of all. So that's point one. Point two is to think about how inside the structure of media groups, our tunnels, our silos basically impact the way we look and talk about the world. And, to give you a small example, journalists tend to create teams that reflect the divisions in the world around them, say like a banking team, a legal team, a politics team, an economy team. And that might be useful for some periods of life, but actually when the world moves on and you have stories that cut across those silos, how do you cope with that? And the last thing is about disseminating the message, because in a world of a very crowded media space, it's so tempting to essentially just give people what you think they want to create sticky audiences, particularly when the media world is so noisy that you have to shout to be heard. The reality is, though, as a journalist, our role is not just to expose social silences and look at the world in a connected way, it's to make people stuck within one silo or tribe actually think about the world more broadly. So one tool I often use is what I call the domino technique, which is not about dominoes topping over in a kind of chain reaction. It's about saying that the game of dominoes has two halves, and you need to match your number in one half with someone else's number, but then the second half can be different. So trying to find ways to connect with your audience by matching up numbers, telling people what they already sort of know or want to hear, but then taking them on somewhere different, that to my mind is the best journalism. Don't always manage to do it, often don't, but that's the goal.
That makes a lot of sense. And so when you scan the horizon, there's so much noise. How do you prioritize? How do you use Anthro-Vision to maybe tell a story that might not so often be told?
Well, as a journalist, as I say, I often don't manage to do that, but that's what I do try to do. And it's partly about going into a situation and asking, okay, so what is no one talking about here? If I was a Martian or a child or somebody from a far-flung country or culture who walked in here today, what would they notice that no one was talking about? What would look weird? What are the kind of inconsistencies in our lives and in the stories we tell ourselves about our lives, which we just ignore? So that's the first thing. And that's exactly what I did before the 2008 financial crisis, which enabled me to see some of the problems developing in complex finance. Back then, all the noise was around the equity markets and the silence was around credit and derivatives. So peering into that was really valuable. And then I'd look for ways to tell that story in an appealing way, to match up the dominoes, if you like. Sometimes that's by telling people a story around a person. Sometimes that's by trying to tap into something people know already or an event that's happened. Sometimes it's by trying to use surprising, shocking, eye-catching symbols or stories or leitmotifs and things like that. But that's the goal.
What's a good way of approaching asking questions in order to get at what not many people are discussing?
Well, one trick is always at the beginning of the interview, if you have time, to say, so what's on your mind? And ask an open-ended question. And, I always go into an interview usually with, something I want to actually talk about, because otherwise I wouldn't arrange the interview. But actually learning to actually let the other person speak for a bit is actually key. Sometimes you get a whole bunch of irritating corporate rubbish coming out or PR spin, but you have to listen to that bit and then cut it off. But often that's very revealing as to what actually they think is the most important thing, and it may not be the same thing as you think. And then at the end, I always ask the question, if I possibly can, so is there anything I've not asked you that you think I should have asked you? And that's often incredibly revealing. And sometimes they're just going to say, no, you've asked everything. Sometimes they come back to whatever corporate, talking points their PR person has given them. And sometimes they go off on a tangent that you didn't even realize you had failed to think about. And then when people are talking, I try hard to listen to the language and the framing, not just the content of what they're saying. Often, when we listen to people in interviews, we often translate what they're saying, the style of what they're saying, into the style that we're used to. And so they might be using a frame of words that we think are old-fashioned, but we often screen those out or translate them into something we recognize. And actually trying to maintain the frame that they're using can be also very revealing, because it shows you, again, a different way of looking at the world and widens your gaze and your lens.
So, Gillian, I'm fascinated. If you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience a little bit about your research for your PhD.
Absolutely. I did my research project in a place called Soviet Tajikistan, just north of Afghanistan. So if you imagine the pictures of Afghanistan you've seen on your TV screens and add in electricity and running water and road, actually not running water, but roads, and then take away the black chadors, the black veils that women wear often in Afghanistan, because in Tajikistan, they wear very colorful clothes. They still cover their heads, but very colorful ways. That's basically Tajikistan. And I went there in 1989 to study what I thought was a big issue there, which was a clash I presumed existed between Islam and communism. Western diplomats assumed there was a clash because the previous couple of decades had been very influenced by a concept in the CIA called the soft underbelly theory. And this presumed that Central Asia would be the first place to stage a rebellion against the Soviet system. And the experience of Afghanistan had shown Islamic Mujahideen could actually challenge the Soviet communist system. So I went into Tajikistan hoping to study that, but because the KGB was there, I couldn't do it openly. So I thought I'd look at marriage rituals to see how they symbolized the clash that existed or didn't exist. So, like most anthropologists, I went off and engaged in what's called participant observation. I went up to the mountains and I lived in a small village with Tajik girls and like a Tajik girl. Slept on the floor with them, swept the floors, did household chores, looked after kids, chased goats, spoke their language, ate their food, basically tried to do what any anthropologist does and to immerse yourself into the people who you're studying and essentially see the world through their eyes. That taught me that actually I was wrong. The type of patterns I saw in weddings and in the everyday lives actually indicated to me there wasn't a clash in the society as much as people thought. There was more a pattern of coexistence between the two systems, partly because Tajik culture subdivided its space into public space and private space and didn't expect the same rules and ideas to rule in both spheres. So, doing anthropology showed me that actually our preconceptions and prejudices that we inherit from our own world can be wrong. And the most effective research is when we actually learn to listen and learn and open our eyes to the possibility there may be other ways of looking at the world.
What's so interesting about your description of the PhD is I can see a direct line between how you approach your interviews at the FT, having a more open approach at the beginning and end of interviews, thinking about the language that you use when you're speaking to people. It's clear that it's very much an anthropological lens that perhaps takes your game plan and your interpretations out of the interview to a greater degree so that you can get closer to the truth.
I'm not saying that you need to simply check in all of your ideas forever at the door. Absorb someone else's point of view. You don't. You can still listen to someone and think, you know what, that's wrong. I listened to the financiers in 2005 and 6 who were engaged in financial innovation, listened what they had to say, and eventually decided that they were wrong. They had a creation myth around the whole goal of financial innovation and investment banking, which turned out to be wrong. But you can't really understand it until you actually just listen on to them or to anybody on their own terms and try to just create space for seeing the world in a different way. And above all else, asking constantly, what are people talking about and what are they not talking about? What is the area of social silence here?
How did you approach understanding or speaking to individuals before the financial crisis in a way that allowed you to make sense of what was happening in a way that others couldn't?
Well, there were two moments when I used my anthropology to really understand finance before 2008. The first was when the editor of the FT asked me to create a memo laying out what we should write about on what's called the Lex column of the FT, which I was the acting head of at the time. And the Lex column is our commentary section. And I sat down and originally wrote the normal memo, which basically involved looking at all the stories we were writing in the FT and trying to compare it to see whether we had enough commentary to match the reporting. And then I suddenly thought, well, hang on a sec, what happened if I treated this like one of my bits of research in Tajikistan with marriage rituals? And what I did in Tajikistan in the village was to walk around the village and to listen to what people said and then actually compare to what was actually happening on the ground. So you're looking at rhetoric and reality. They say so-and-so is really important, but how many goats do they have and where are they actually sitting in the marriage ceremonies? And when I did that in the City of London, it showed me that there was this, what I called an iceberg phenomena developing, in that there was a huge amount of attention paid to one tiny part of the City of London, which was equity markets, and that dominated the reporting. And there was then this vast, shadowy underbelly of stuff that everyone was ignoring, which was to do with credit and derivatives. And people said they were ignoring it because it was geeky and dull and boring and stuff, but it mattered. So I decided I wanted to focus more on that. And out of that, I ended up moving to run the capital market section of the FT. And the second moment came when I just arrived there. And I went down to a banking conference in Nice. Investment banking conferences tend to happen in nice places like Nice or Boca Raton. They don't happen in sort of, in other parts of the world. And when I arrived, I saw that there was this gigantic conference underway, this great big ceremony and ritual, if you like, which was incredibly similar to the Tajik weddings that I had once analyzed. And they have the same function. They pull together a scattered tribe of people. They allow them to reaffirm their social ties. And most importantly of all, they allow them to recreate a common worldview, a set of shared values. And the rituals and symbols reflect that common worldview and then reinforce it. And when I looked around the hall with that lens, there were four things that struck me. Firstly, it was a very distinct tribe of people who thought they were separate from others and didn't expect others to peer into what they were doing. Secondly, one way they maintained that separation was by being in control of a language jargon that no one else understood, sort of banker speak. Thirdly, they had a very strong creation mythology. And every social group has a creation myth, which almost always supports the position of the elite. So there's nothing wrong with it. But like all creation myths, their creation myth had contradictions, particularly around this idea of liquidity. They claimed that they were doing everything to make markets more liquid. But in reality, the products was too complicated to trade most of the time. So in fact, there weren't even free market prices for many of them. And then last but not least, when I looked at the PowerPoints they were using to reflect and reaffirm that sort of shared understanding, although the creation myth said that we're serving people, there weren't any faces in their PowerPoints. And it was a very good indication of how they had essentially created a vision of finance in their heads, which was all about maths. And the consequences of what they were doing was kind of taken out of the analysis. So there was tunnel vision, there was a lack of context, there was a sense of elitism, there was a lack of external scrutiny, there was an inability to see the consequences of what they were up to. And you put those things together and you had the makings for trouble.
And part of what you're describing is individuals who are in a leadership position that are reinforcing each other's point of view. What are some of the elements of Anthro-Vision that can help individuals in positions of power, any decision maker in a business, to break out of these blind spots?
Well, this is one of the most important messages of my book. And I think one reason why it's got a very practical value and it can help anybody when they're trying to navigate the world today. What Anthro-Vision does is basically embrace the concept of a bit of culture shock. The idea that it pays to immerse yourself in the minds and lives of others periodically. And the others can be on the other side of the world, like in Tajikistan. It can just be the team in the next door department in your company who are working in a different type of professional training. And the value of doing that is twofold. One, you gain empathy from another point of view, and you understand how the world works better, which is very important. Two, though, it allows you to think outside yourself and look back and see yourself more clearly. Because there's this wonderful Chinese proverb that a fish can't see water, because we can't see the assumptions we're so used to. But when we jump out of our fish bowls and actually go into another pond, we can then see water more clearly. And essentially what any leader today needs to do is spend time thinking about how they can jump out of their ponds periodically to look back at themselves, see how other people see them, see how their actions, which they regard as commonplace and obvious, might seem very weird to others. See all the structural flaws in their own lives or the contradictions they're ignoring, and see the areas of social silence. And boy, do we need that. And I say we need that not because there's any malice or bad behavior on the part of leaders, but because all of our professional training systems are geared towards putting people into tunnels. You know, you become an expert in something, you rise up an academic department, you rise up a corporate department, you become, in charge of your own special fiefdom. It's all about putting yourself into some form of tunnel. And the more successful you are, the greater the danger that you don't see what a tunnel you're in. And you don't even see that, not everyone else thinks the same way that you do.
Question for you on incentives, thinking about leaders and why they make the decisions that they do. I've seen journalists who've written about Enron, for example, say, I've illuminated, a situation that clearly was going to go wrong, but actually if I was working for Enron, perhaps it would have been more difficult to identify, to be the whistleblower, or to make a decision that was counter to what my tribe was saying was right. And I'm just wondering, if we place ourselves in the shoes of business leaders that are incentivized to be confident, or incentivized to say that don't worry, employees, my plans will work. How do we tackle that imbalance, that you're incentivized to be confident at all times and reinforce and create more confidence, when really we need to maybe gain a bit more perspective to ensure that we're tracking in the right direction?
Well, I think you need to imagine it a bit like a sort of, a diet. Everyone says your food groups need to be mixed up. Everyone's intellectual tool sets and mentalities need to be mixed up. And if you're just eating protein or just eating carbohydrates, you're in trouble. So if you're just being super confident and imposing your will and your view on everyone else all the time, you might do very well for a period of time. You may also, though, trip up. And that wonderful thing of Caesar, of, he wanted a slave to basically walk behind him and whisper in his ear, remember that you're human. Obviously, that sort of precise story can't be extrapolated in today's world, and we all agree that slaves should not exist. But the point is that, we all need somebody to actually be there as a check and balance. And if you think that anthropology all sounds hippy-dippy and, a bit irrelevant, just think of two concepts which are baked into American capitalism. One is checks and balances. We all know checks and balances matter in politics. They matter in corporate life. They matter in how we look at the world. And what anthropology can offer is a check and balance to whatever you think is correct. Or if you think about another way, think about fear and greed and empathy. You might think that getting empathy from another viewpoint is just about being hippy-dippy. It's actually, there are reasons to do it for reasons of fear and greed. If you don't understand other people, you may be constantly surprised by shocks, unexpected reactions, things that trip you up. If you do try to understand another point of view, you might actually learn lessons which can make you more innovative, creative, smarter, and engage in lateral thinking.
And resilient, as you're pointing out.
The resilience part is actually comes on fear because, resilience is one of the key buzzwords now. And resilience involves basically preparing for many eventualities. And to do that, you need to have lateral vision. And one of the metaphors I often use to explain to people why this matters is that imagine a dark wood at night and you're walking through it with a compass. If you're walking through a dark wood at night with a compass, you don't want to throw a compass away. And a compass could be your economic model, it could be your corporate balance sheet, it could be your big data set, or it could be your absolute conviction that you alone have the answer to whatever problem you're trying to fix. But if you walk through that wood and you only stare down at that compass all the time and never raise your eyes from the dial, you will almost certainly walk into a tree or trip over a tree root, even if the compass tells you where you should head in a general sense. So what I'm arguing for is Anthro-Vision, which is a way of looking up, getting lateral vision to look around the world and just get smarter.
It's almost a self-interest in looking outside of yourself, which ties really well to the Moral Money story. So I've been a reader of the Moral Money newsletter at the FT from the beginning. And when you started the newsletter, I just was absolutely thrilled. And I've been really enjoying it. For any listeners that have not come across the Moral Money newsletter, please check it out. It's wonderful. I'm interested, Gillian, how did this project start? So how did you use Anthro-Vision to then decide that this was a good step for the Financial Times?
Well, like many of the things I've done in my life, it started because of a mistake, because of me getting something wrong, which was back in 2016-17. I was running the editorial operations of the FT in North America. And everyone at the time was obsessed with Donald Trump, only thing that journalists wanted to talk about. And I was too. And I got very irritated. And I noticed one day that I was getting irritated because I kept getting these emails from companies and institutions talking about sustainability and ESG. And I, like most journalists, thought ESG sounded like a bunch of pious PR spin by companies. In fact, I used to joke that ESG should stand for eye roll, sneer, and groan, not environmental social governance, and most people think it stands for. So I'd get these emails, I'd go, oh, eye roll, sneer, and groan. Here they come again, delete them all. And then I suddenly thought, actually, I should stop and go back to my one-on-one anthropology and ask why I'm getting these emails. And, I might think they're ridiculous as a journalist, but they're clearly being driven for a reason. And frankly, rituals matter. People often think rituals don't matter because it doesn't correspond to reality. They actually present an idealized version of reality, which are interesting to look at. So I did some digging and realized that a really huge zeitgeist shift was underway in the world of business and finance towards embracing sustainability. And I also realized that I had misunderstood that sector because, to go back to the point about noise and silence, the noise around sustainability was about saving the world and doing good. And that had been how that whole movement started. But by 2016 or 17, it was actually as much about saving yourself and defense, risk management as anything else. And what I mean by that was that companies and finance were realizing that although they'd spent the previous few decades using these very narrow economic models and very strictly defined corporate balance sheets to navigate the world with, all this stuff was occurring outside the models and the balance sheets, which kind of mattered and had the ability to cause reputational damage, to cause the loss of employees, investors, clients, cause regulatory problems or reputational damage. And these things were stuff like the environment, which used to be an externality in economic models or a footnote on corporate balance sheets. There were things like social tensions, racial problems, sexual harassment issues. I mean, that used to be at best a footnote in the corporate accounts until the hashtag #MeToo scandal suddenly showed leaders and investors that you couldn't just ignore it because it was outside your frame of reference. To go back to the compass and wood analogy, people were realizing that if they just looked at the compass dial and ignored the externalities, they could suffer. So interest in sustainability was rising for risk management purposes as much as any kind of sudden discovery of a conscience or halos and things like that. I'm not saying that people don't care. Many corporate leaders do care, but the driving impetus was actually the silence in the situation around risk management. So I got really interested. I bounced around the FT telling my colleagues that we should create a newsletter. Took a while for us to launch it. Not everyone was quite as excited initially, but we did launch it in the summer of 2019. Got lucky with the timing. Almost immediately afterwards, the Business Roundtable issued their famous embrace of stakeholderism. And since then, it's been extraordinarily gratifying to see it take off very rapidly.
Internally at the Financial Times, coming from an anthropology background, how did you go about presenting the idea? Perhaps knowing that, well, if you study groups, you're looking to influence a group. How did you break down that process?
Well, it wasn't always that easy, to be honest. And it's a question of trying to explain to people why stories matter. And that's a challenge you face every day in a newsroom. You have to sell your story to your colleagues. And that requires plugging it into a particular cultural dynamic about how people define what a story is. And journalists tend to assume that a story involves scandal, drama, step change, etc., etc. And if stories involve slow-moving elliptical changes in the zeitgeist that don't seem like bad news necessarily and don't have clear names and people involved, it's a much harder sell. I had that actually, ironically, with credit derivatives back in 2005. I mean, trying to get attention to that field was difficult then because of all the jargon and fragmentation. And one of the other problems with sustainability is that it's been a field that's been incredibly fragmented, full of jargon, very opaque. Writing about it often feels like chasing soap in the bath. And that makes it harder to sell as a story.
You were speaking about, Gillian, the fact that there's now self-interest. What you saw before you founded Moral Money was that there's self-interest trying to protect the corporate entity from ESG factors. It was no longer just about doing good. I was speaking with a utility earlier this week, and I wanted to use the utility example because effectively, if you're a utility and you're running a nuclear power plant or a suite of plants, it's not like you want a culture of move fast and break things. It's very much a, safety culture. It's a culture of wanting to be quite systematic. And we were talking about ESG. We were talking about trade-offs in ESG and what net zero means. I'm interested in your view, Gillian. Let's forget, the fancy slides. Let's forget, the fancy strategy jargon. If you're working with a group of people, say, that is looking to go from a centralized system to a decentralized system to save on carbon, it's a completely different business model. How do you start to engage the culture? How do you use Anthro-Vision to start to have this conversation? Or maybe it's also about listening. I'm interested in how you would tackle that challenge.
I think there are three things you need to do. The first is to self-evidently listen to other people and try to understand what they're saying about the problem on their own terms. And if there's resistance, work out, what they're actually saying and pay respect to it. Secondly, to think about social silence and work out if there are issues at foot which are causing people to resist something, which are not the official stated reason or even the verbalized reason, but something else. The Japanese have this wonderful phrase, tatamai and hone, which means external appearances and inner truth. And, to take an example, often when people say that's a terrible idea, I'm going to, resist that. They might be saying it because they genuinely think it's a terrible idea. It's often because actually they feel that somehow it's going to undercut their power structures. It's going to remove their power base. It's going to, reduce their sense of credibility in them, sense of hierarchy or status, all of those issues. And so any good manager knows this, but trying to actually think about it actively, embrace it and work with it is part of the challenge. And then, I'd say trying to use another trick from anthropology was to jump out of yourself and look back in, trying to think about how other industries, other institutions have embraced or tackled these challenges can be really useful. So just trying to learn lessons from elsewhere can also help. Last but not least, one of the things that anthropologists do is spend a lot of time thinking about rituals and symbols and ceremonies, and trying to think about the use of symbols and rituals and how that might be a way of trying to break down resistance or get a debate on the table, et cetera, can be very useful too. Or alternatively, to think about how it's actually damaging discussion. To give a very silly example, not silly example, it's a very important example, but give an example from my book. General Motors tried a few years ago to get a joint project between 3 teams from Detroit, Tennessee, and Rüsselsheim in Germany to collaborate on building a new small car. And they put the engineers together. It was pretty disastrous because they spent almost a year trying to design the new small car and they couldn't agree. And they kept having meetings to talk about it, and that made the problem worse. And they thought it was an engineering problem, and they thought maybe it's a kind of ethnic problem, German-American. But an anthropologist came in and watched them and realized that one of the issues was that the different groups were going into their meetings with completely different preconceptions about what a meeting was supposed to achieve. Some people think that a meeting's about doing work, and that's where work gets done. Some people think it's something that happens at the end of work, when you've already done the work, and then you have a meeting to basically validate it. Some people think it's about brainstorming in an egalitarian way and letting everyone air their views. Some people think it's actually about having a leader demonstrate their status and power by essentially imposing views on everyone. And neither of those approaches are necessarily wrong. They can all work, but what they can't do is work when different groups have entirely different unstated assumptions around the point of a meeting. So if you're trying to effect change, think about the unstated assumptions, both in yourself and others.
That cultural relativity ties back to your point about standing outside of yourself in order to understand if you're telling yourself a narrative that you're very happy with, but doesn't necessarily take you to where you'd like to go. I would like to dig into this concept of standing outside of yourself and how it links to trust. So leading into this, I would say, so I mentioned off the top that, I was reading ethnographies of Wall Street before I joined Bain & Company. And I remember talking to a friend. I was within the first year, this is, 2011, I guess. I was talking to a friend, a barrister. We sat down to dinner and I was breaking down the culture of Bain. And I owe Bain a lot. It was a great place to work. But I was talking about how people spoke, what symbols we used, what we were trying to achieve, etc. And he stopped me. He's my friend. My friend's name's Max. Max stopped me. He asked me, "Jen, are you a spy?" kind of thing. He was really intrigued. It was almost as though it was an outsider to the point of wanting to collect intelligence of some sort. And that got me thinking a lot about, well, how I find these tools really helpful for understanding how an organization works. But I guess it's important not to go so far that you lose trust. And I'm just wondering, Gillian, from your perspective, this must be something that comes up a lot in anthropological research. How do you maintain trust while you stand outside of yourself and while you're also observing other cultures and trying to figure out how to weave together those ideas in order to move forward or describe what you're seeing?
Well, I think honesty is probably the best. Honesty and empathy is probably the best way to do that. I think that's the easiest thing to do. And also a sense of humor. But those are the main things. I mean, the answer is yes. People have asked me if I was a spy in Tajikistan. I can say on the record, quite categorically, I was not. I'm far too indiscreet. I became a journalist because I like telling people about other people rather than finding out about other people and keeping it to myself. So I think those are the main things: empathy, honesty, and a sense of humor.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, look, my last question for you, Gillian, before we wrap up, it's a question I love to ask, and it's a bit tricky to answer, but let's give it a shot. So if you had to pick just one book or one idea that has particularly shaped your perspective, what book or idea would that be, Gillian?
If I'm allowed to say two books.
You're allowed.
The book that has really shaped my perspective is a book by a French intellectual called Pierre Bourdieu, who, to my mind, is one of the most brilliant thinkers of the 20th century. He's barely known outside France or outside the world of anthropology and, oddly enough, architecture, but he is absolutely brilliant. And his ideas about how we all develop mental maps that are expressed in space and habits and then reinforced in space and habits is so powerful and so profound, along with his concept that basically power structures emerge not just because of economic capital, who has money, but social capital, who has the friends and the networks of influence, political capital, ditto, and also cultural capital. And cultural capital we don't talk about, but it's a fascinating issue in terms of how people reproduce and project status. The problem is that Bourdieu is very hard to read, even in English, and probably equally hard in French. So, that's why I hesitate to make it the one book that's influenced me, but Bourdieu's ideas have deeply influenced me. In terms of books that have influenced me recently, I would give a shout out to Joseph Henrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World, about the difference between what he calls weird cultures, Western educated, individualistic, rich and democratic, and non-weird. Everyone should read it to think about what an alphabet and literacy does to the way your brain works, and most importantly, to recognize how weird Westerners are compared to the sweep of history.
Gillian Tett, thank you so much for joining the Future in Sound podcast. For everybody listening, definitely pick up Anthro-Vision. It's a wonderful read.
Thank you.
Thank you to Gillian Tett for joining us. You can learn more about her book, Anthro-Vision, by checking out the links in the episode description or by visiting re.co.com/thefutureinsound. The Future in Sound podcast is written and hosted by Jen Wilson and produced by Chris Attaway. This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a market intelligence company helping clients achieve resilient competitive advantage in the long term. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell a friend about it. And if you have a moment, rate us in your podcast app. Until next time, thanks for listening.